Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com program, brought to you by Techstrong and Palo Alto Networks. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting presentation ahead. First, I do need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, maybe you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we do want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab. You can find the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen, where you'll also find the chat tab. And the chat tab is just for your general discussion, get to know your fellow audience members, or maybe let us know from where you're joining us. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of today's program. So our topic today is a hacker's perspective on serverless. And I'm joined by Mohit Bhasin, Senior Product Manager at Prisma Cloud and Palo Alto Networks, and Daniel Prizmant, Principal Researcher at Palo Alto Networks. So Mohit and Daniel, thank you both so much for joining me. Mohit, would you like to take us away?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Cody, for the wonderful introduction. So my name is Mohit Bhasin. I'm on the Prisma Cloud team here at Palo Alto Networks, and I also have Daniel joining me here today. Daniel, do you want to do a quick intro and tell the
Yeah,
audience
sure.
what are you?
Sure. I'm a principal researcher at the Prisma Cloud security team. I do mostly focus on security research and vulnerability research, threat hunting, stuff like that. And in the last couple of months, I did some significant research on serverless computing, serverless function, Azure serverless, all those sort of things. So we'll talk about that today.
Yeah, and my background is mainly in application development and now cloud workload security. And I'm grateful that Daniel's here today because he's the expert on serverless security. I'm going to be mainly be asking him questions around recent trends on why folks are using serverless security, and then I also have some fun stats. I'm going to read off a slide for you guys on things that I've seen in the market as well as what we've seen from analyst research. But the overall reason why we're doing this is because we've noticed that businesses are leveraging serverless computing more and more often for their cloud native applications, and it's just that oftentimes when we think of serverless, we think that it doesn't have any servers and it's inherently more secure because the cloud provider is providing it, but that's not often the case. And that's some of the key things that I want to go over today is what is serverless, why it matters, and things like that. But just to give you background, serverless computing was officially formalized as an offering by AWS, I think back in 2014 at one of their reInvent conferences. And today, the serverless market is now a $7.2 billion market, and it's expected to reach, I think, $37 billion by 2028. So the market is growing. We've seen customers leveraging it. We've seen folks finding value in using serverless functions as well as serverless computing. And before I get into that, Daniel, in your opinion, what is serverless computing?
Okay. So before I go into this, it's important for me to know that I don't pretend to be like a serverless expert, but because my research focused on that in the last couple of months, I think I could provide some significant background. So serverless computing, serverless function, basically sort of feature of serverless computing, usually referred to just as serverless, where the cloud provider supplies all the computing resources on demand for the customers and manages all the architecture, including the cloud infrastructure. So a great example for an ideal application for serverless is a chatbot, for example. Slack, for instance, uses serverless application called Marbot to send notification from Amazon Web Services, AWS, to DevOps team through Slack. So that's like an example of a stateless application. It doesn't need a database or something like that. It gets a request, send a response.
So you just gave everyone an intro into what is serverless computing. So we're going to throw a poll up for everyone just to understand how much they know about serverless. So the question is, how familiar are you with serverless right now? And we have three options: not familiar, familiar, very familiar. And we just want to get a baseline understanding of where you guys are in your serverless security journey today. And I'm hoping we can put that poll on the screen as well to share with the audience how folks responded. Most people are somewhat familiar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we get it. We're getting a few not familiar, and then we're getting a few very familiar. So I feel like the folks who typed very familiar could teach us a thing or two about serverless computing as well.
Probably.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, because like you said, we're not the experts. So Daniel, I just went over what is serverless. Now, can you answer? This is a weird question to ask, but what is not serverless?
Okay,
What is serverless not? Yeah.
so that's actually a topic I'm kind of passionate about because that's what got me into this research. I heard the name serverless. I didn't know anything about it. I just assumed it's some sort of magical technology that doesn't involve servers. And but the name serverless is misleading. Despite its name, serverless computing still requires physical servers to execute the code. The major difference from traditional computing is that serverless abstracts away anything that isn't directly related to the code itself. So from the operating system that runs the code to the hardware of the machine, serverless abstracts all of that away. But it's not actually serverless. There are still servers. They're just not exactly visible to the end user.
All right, great. So if you guys didn't know, and you heard it from Daniel here first, serverless does require serverless, but because these resources are on demand for you to use, you can use them however you use them on demand whenever you call them. And I think that's why it's important to mention what he said earlier. These are stateless, so they run based off of events that you trigger, and they only run when you want them to run. But Daniel, can you go into what are some benefits of serverless computing? Because you're still running a server, so why do folks find it more attractive than running a container or maybe just a VM?
Yeah, sure. Actually, before I go into that, I think I can provide some extra background on all of the statelessness of serverless, if I can call it that way.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Because the research I performed actually uncovered some of it, some of the background, the architecture of it, of how it works. So basically, when your new function is executed on demand, like for example, a web page call or a web request or stuff like that, a new container is issued. And all I'm saying is relevant specifically for Azure, but because that's the platform I researched. But I imagine other cloud providers work in a similar way. So basically, you have like a virtual machine or an actual server, depends on how high the load of that instance is. And when you try to run a serverless function or application, for example, a user issued a new web request, the machine starts a new container on the cloud, and that container eventually runs your code. So it is possible with some sort of like hacking and shenanigans to make serverless actually with states, because the virtual machine or the server that runs the containers, it stays up. Only the containers dies when it's done providing the results, or after like 10 minutes or something like that. So calling that like stateless is, I mean, they want the cloud providers want to treat it that way, but eventually in the background, in the architecture, there is still a VM that stays up and can store files or databases or stuff like that. And you asked what are the benefits of serverless architecture. So I think the main benefits of serverless architecture is ease of use and scalability. Developers can have their applications up and running in literally minutes, and it's also very easy to scale up. So when I got into this research, I wanted to play a little bit with the platform just to get the hang of it. And in like 5 minutes, I had like a decent application running without knowing anything about the platform, the subject.
Yeah, you don't have to like decide the OS or worry about like the actual compute under.
You can choose the OS actually. At least in Azure, you can choose the OS, but you don't have to.
And how well did it scale for you?
Actually, that's a topic I didn't research too much. Obviously, I'm on the research side, so scaling didn't really interest me that much. I just wanted to test for security, so I can't answer that.
All right, so maybe you can answer this one. Did it cost you a lot to run serverless versus a traditional VM?
Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
It was relatively cheap compared to the other options or other research I performed in the cloud.
And
because if you didn't run a lot, at least
if it didn't run, it doesn't
in
charge
Azure,
you, right?
yeah, it didn't charge me if I didn't run a lot of functions or didn't have like a lot of requests.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that like when it comes to security in the cloud, like it's still a shared responsibility model between you and the cloud provider. It still applies. Like although like AWS or Azure is still responsible for securing like the physical security of the infrastructure, making sure like the networks work between the actual infrastructure, the customer is still responsible for however they use the offerings. And the same thing applies to serverless security. Like whoever uses, the same thing applies to serverless functions. Whoever uses serverless functions is still responsible for securing them. So I wanted to ask you, like, how secure are serverless functions like out of the box?
So serverless is relatively new architecture, so it is possible that significant research hasn't been done yet. It is also very cloud provider related. So it is harder to find major issues that apply to all cloud providers. For example, the issues I found in Azure wouldn't necessarily be applied to AWS or Google. That being said, as far as I know, no major security vulnerability has been found so far in the architectural level. However, as any piece of software, it is only secured as it least secured piece of code. So in a case developers write a vulnerable piece of code, they might put other functions of other user in the organization at risk. And you talked about a relationship between the cloud provider and the user. The cloud providers goes to extent lengths to make sure that even if the user is irresponsible and writes vulnerable code, it will only in risk his own resources. Like they are putting significant resources to make sure an attacker that breached to one customer who wouldn't be able to leverage it to breach another customers.
Yeah, I was gonna say that makes a lot of sense, because if someone, like he says, is irresponsible, messes up their environment, it only infects whatever they have in their environment, not like other folks' like environments as well.
In Azure, you can see it even more clear because, for example, I managed to break out of the container barrier of my own function, and I only had access to other functions in the organization, other functions that my user, my Azure user, had access to anyways. So I mean, it's not insignificant, but it's not like I could reach data of a different customer.
Yeah, and how did you break out of your own Azure function?
That's a very long story. I have a technical article about it.
Oh man,
Will be published in a few
yeah,
weeks. But the bottom line is the way the container was configured was not very secured in my opinion. But I Microsoft will probably Microsoft probably don't think like that because they don't consider containers to be a security boundary anyways. So from their point of view, the fact that I broke out of the container doesn't mean a thing because it's not a security boundary to begin with.
Okay. And this leads me to my next question. Like, what are like the top risks facing like serverless applications?
Okay, so like we said earlier, serverless is traditionally used for stateless applications.
Yeah.
So usually it would be harder to pull out like high impact attacks. And I'm saying harder and not impossible because the possibilities are rather endless. Take for example the example I gave earlier about the Slack bot. The Slack bot sends messages to DevOps engineers, and all those DevOps engineers they know to that messages that come from this Slack bot are trusted because they think their organization sent it. And now just imagine that an attacker, managed to take control of the function that send those notifications to the DevOps engineer. They could probably leverage some sort of like social engineering attack, sending fake messages. So I don't think it's true to say like because serverless is usually stateless, it's risk-free because it really doesn't. It just the more like traditional attacks of ransomwares and stuff like that, or breaching the entire database, those will be harder to pull off.
So do things like denial of like or like leak secrets or like event injection like still apply to like serverless as well? Like where you can inject like certain pieces of like code within that function?
Yeah, definitely. Because serverless can still, for example, implement a web page, and you don't know what this web page is used for, who uses it. And in that example, if I'm an attacker and I manage to take control of such serverless application, I could probably modify the web page to my needs, and you don't know what the users of this web page will put over there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I know that like, when it comes to application security, I think it's like a really like team sport between like DevOps and security teams. And do you have any like organizational best practices on like what teams can do to protect their serverless functions or serverless computing applications?
I would say that definitely check for resource consumption of your serverless function. That would usually be the first thing an attacker would do. And again, those are like usually the most common attacks. They are not necessarily the most dangerous or impactful, but most of the case is usually small attackers group trying to take advantage and leverage free performance, free resources.
Yeah. Do you think crypto mining happens often with serverless functions?
I'm not sure if I would call that frequently because I don't have an actual data about the subject. But I imagine that the machines that run serverless usually they are very powerful, so they can be leveraged for crypto mining or other tasks that requires a lot of performance power.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think in my opinion, just understanding like you said, what's running in your environment is like very key because you don't want to pay for things that you didn't really execute or run on because you got hacked or popped. Yeah. So this leads me to like my next question. Like, what are like a few things that folks are could do today to like start securing like their serverless applications against attacks like crypto mining or maybe just like event injection data or just stealing of resources?
So I don't want to sound like I'm trying to sell the audience security products,
Yeah.
but I actually do believe that another set of eyes in the form of some security product could be very helpful. Maybe
Hmm.
you have like 100 different functions, and it's harder to keep every single one of them secured. It's also difficult to constantly check them for suspicious activity. or making sure they are all updated without any known vulnerabilities. This is where external security products can come in handy. And in a perfect world, the cloud provider would always alert you on suspicious activity and would keep all your data, all your applications up to date without any known one day's vulnerability in any of your products. But in the real world, that's not the case. So I definitely think like some sort of security product could help in that regard.
Yeah, like when you talk about like security product, like what does a security product need to have in terms of capabilities for someone to get started? Like what are some like top 3 or top 5 capabilities that you recommend?
I would say I think the most common attacks happen when not just cloud resources, but any resources in the internet uh, is vulnerable. It happens when it's vulnerable to a known vulnerability. Like for example, 0 days vulnerabilities. They're rather expensive. Attackers like attack groups usually wouldn't waste a 0 day to just harvest performance power. Those are much more expensive than the actual the performance they will gain. So most of the time, attackers use known vulnerabilities. So my number one is to keep all your applications, all your cloud applications, serverless functions, everything up to date without any known vulnerabilities. When you have like one or two serverless functions, one or two containers on the cloud, it's really easy to do. But when your organization have hundreds of those, it's it's getting complicated and harder to keep everything up to date. And you also don't want to update everything for every little small issue. Like for example, a new vulnerability with a CVSS score of like 3. That's not really dangerous. You don't want to stop everything and update just for that. You
Yeah,
want to be alerted
I think if
only
you,
on the critical
I was
things.
gonna say if you take a step back, like in my opinion, I think like the first step is like just visibility, like you said, like understanding everything that's running in your environment and like understanding like its risk score of like, oh, if it is running any vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, like what's the impact of it and how urgent is it to fix today? I think like that's the key part. It's just gaining that visibility and then understanding risk for your environment. And then from there you can actually go and actually implement protections like alerting or blocking certain serverless functions from running within your environments or things like that. But I think that's like the first step that anyone needs to take if they're trying to secure them.
Definitely. And I will be honest with you, when I first started with cloud research about almost 4 years ago,
Yeah.
I honestly didn't find all the security products that important. I thought to myself, what's the problem of just keeping all my applications secure and updated?
Yeah.
But when you see the size of some of those cloud infrastructure with hundreds of containers and serverless functions, you're starting to realize how hard it is to keep track. Every single day, new vulnerabilities come out, and it's hard to keep track of everything and what part of like your
Yeah.
infrastructure is vulnerable and whatnot.
Yeah. You know, between me and you, like in an ideal world, you would update all vulnerabilities and you would fix everything, but that would just take forever, right? And that's not the
Hmm.
case. So it's really like what is the most critical right now and what is the most important right now. And that like I said, it all starts from like understanding like your risk score, your risk posture, and trying to correlate risk not only for your serverless function, but like all your cloud resources and what you have in that environment and what's affecting your application. Once you're able to correlate that risk, then you focus on like the top vulnerabilities or like the top priorities because I think those are the most dangerous to have in your environment while it's running.
Hmm.
Yeah. I want to shift our focus just like a little bit, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for the audience so that they can ask us any questions that they have. So we talked about just what an ideal security product we would have. I just want to make a little plug that Palo Alto Networks, Prisma Cloud does have a serverless security offering. I won't talk about it too much. There is a link in the handouts for those that are interested to find out more. But what I do want to talk about is like best practices that organizations can take. I think one thing that we don't understand is like we have to educate our internal folks on the matter of like why it's important to secure cloud resources, why is it important to secure serverless functions, and we have to also provide like the relevant training on how to go and assess risk and things like that. And I think sometimes like customers think that like, oh, or if I just buy a security product and put it in place, like it'll automatically like protect me. But the thing is, it also depends on how your organization views security and how they communicate with each other. Like, what's your view on that?
Okay, so like I said, in an ideal world, a security product for the cloud would be like an iPhone. You buy it, you turn it on, it just works. You don't need to configure anything. It just works out of the box. But
Yeah.
the reality is, we are talking about something that is far more complicated, and every organization have different needs, different restraints, different restrictions, and those products, they need to be configured. And for that, you really need to know what you're facing, what the threats you're dealing with, what is a critical vulnerability, what is less relevant right now, and yeah, you need to know this stuff. We're still not in the stage of an organization just installing a security product and it just working out of the box perfectly. We are not there yet.
No, I totally agree. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, let's open it up to Q&A for everyone. Everyone, please. We are trying to make this as interactive as possible. Submit your questions in the Q&A session. We will try to answer all of them, if not most. And then one thing we also want to do while you guys think of Q&A is, Cody, can we put up that same poll that we had earlier to get an understanding of how familiar folks are with serverless now versus before? Because I want to understand, was this even helpful to everyone? All right, and maybe we can throw those results on the screen as well. Okay, wow, 36%. So someone still said not familiar. So I was hoping we'd be able to push most of the not familiars into familiar or very familiar. With that, for those that said they're not familiar, any questions on serverless computing or serverless security that we can answer, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll take them one at a time. All right, there was one question in the chat that says, are serverless functions inherently more secure than containers?
No, not at all. In fact, serverless functions are containers, at least on Azure.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. They're actually the same thing, but that's a very long story. I hope you will be able to read about it in like a few weeks.
Interesting. And then we had another question that said, what do you think the future of serverless looks like?
Okay, so that's probably a more suitable question for you because you talked about the how it will scale in a few years, what the market will be.
To me, I think that we're just scratching the tip on serverless computing, just because it's not widely known, it's not widely used today, and because it's like so stateless and event driven and it is cheaper, I think as applications evolve more and more and they become more modular, like folks will start building out specific functions for specific needs, and then they'll call that function based off of when they need to drive it. And like you said, like because it's on demand for services like a chatbot or services like maybe you're taking in information or running like a query on a certain database. I think serverless functions will really grow in the fact that they're just doing very modularized tasks, kind of like an API, but for your computing layer, your application. All right, with that, it doesn't look like there's many other questions in the chat. Oh, we had one saying, are there still cost issues around serverless pricing? Someone says, oh, my Lambda function was buggy and now I owe Amazon $3 billion.
I wouldn't be able to speak to that. It didn't happen to me.
Yeah, I think with cost, like in an ideal world, serverless functions should cost less because you're using them less. Like your Lambda function should only be used whenever you call it. So ideally, it should charge less, and then you should be able to see that pricing within AWS's like pricing calculator on what they're charging you for. Or maybe you shouldn't leave your serverless function running all night or something like that, because that might be the incorrect thing. Or maybe you got hacked and someone's mining cryptocurrency on your serverless function from China at like 3 a.m. in the middle of the night. So I would say just make sure you're monitoring all your cloud resources and then understanding how you're being charged, because ideally it should cost less.
Actually, on Azure, they killed the function after 10 minutes. I don't say it will stop attackers trying to abuse that, because they can just issue a new request and issue a new function request.
Mm-hmm.
But a single function wouldn't run for more than 10 minutes.
Yeah. We had an interesting question in the chat as well. It's like, how do you make a decision on when to use serverless or not?
I think the first thing is it like architecturally fitting? Like, is your needs can be stateless? Don't try to do like serverless function with like a database behind it that the serverless function contacting. So if your application is stateless and you run it in like all the cloud provider different calculators, and you see it's going to be cheaper with serverless, then sure, why not? Also, if it's something you don't need to be running all the time, like a web server doesn't do anything while he doesn't serve clients. And if you don't have many clients, maybe it will be beneficial for you to use it as serverless and not like a server that's running all the time.
Yeah, I would agree. Don't force it. If you need to run it, then run it. But it depends on your architecture and what you're building. All right. There's another question in the chat. Are there any industries that should utilize serverless? Any inherent industries that would benefit from serverless versus not serverless?
When I'm trying to think about it from an analytical point of view, I'm thinking about again the web server. So a traditional web server is running all the time. It's consuming some amount of power all the time, and it is serving only a single web page, like a single website of a single customer usually, and that's not that efficient, because this server maybe serving clients like every 10 minutes or every hour or something like that. And the architecture of serverless, where a virtual machine can serve multiple customers in multiple web servers and initiate a container that's hosting the very specific server on demand, that in theory that sounds like more efficient than traditional servers. We are still just scratching the surface, I feel, in this technology. Maybe it will become more popular and more efficient in the future.
Yeah, let's see if it gets cheaper so that one person doesn't have to owe Amazon $3 billion. Cool. All right. This doesn't seem like there's any more questions. If you guys want to add us on LinkedIn, if you want to add Daniel on Twitter or anything else, like feel free to do so. We're open to answering questions there as well, and we appreciate the time that everyone took. And I want to thank Daniel for coming on and speaking about everything serverless. And I want to thank everyone else for taking the time to stay on and listen to us about serverless security.
Awesome. Well, Mohit and Daniel, thank you both. We did actually just receive one more question, so I think we've got time to squeeze it in. Is it advisable to use serverless for batch processing that generally runs for an hour on our current environment?
That's not advisable.
Yeah.
That's that's exactly the use case that will eventually yield you a higher bill than doing that in like traditional servers or like containers as service or stuff like that.
I was going to say you might as well use a container at that point.
Awesome. Thank you both for that. So to our audience members, do send in any more questions you have. We've got about a minute and a half before I do officially take us off the air. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and give away a couple of gift cards. So these are for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our first winner is Josephine S. Our second winner is Ryan C. Our third winner is Vikas C. And our fourth winner is Guillermo B. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Do please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder. And I'd also like to remind everyone that this session was recorded. Following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access this recording on demand, or you can find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. I would like to give a big shout out to Palo Alto Networks for sponsoring today's program, and to everyone who joined us for the past 40 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate the time that you take to spend with us, and we just want to ask for one more moment of your time for a survey that will pop up as soon as we close out. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Everyone, have a great rest of your day.